So 3 years ago we had Clayfest in Scotland, and it was near where we live, and part of the funding for that came from a landscape heritage project we were working on, and that involved Ibuki, which you all know now, and ARC, which is my architectural practice, and Rebirth, which is Becky's thing. And let's see if this works. And so that was us 3 years ago, having fun.
There's your transition,
over an hour.
Yeah.
And that was then, and then that was part of a 3-year project. And so just for those who are not from this part of the world, so this is the North Atlantic. And we're down here somewhere, and
Somewhere down.
okay. So we're up here. This is where I'm talking about, and that's Scotland. And I guess where we're talking about is here. So we got this broad swathe of what we now call muck, running up through the country that this is part of, and Scotland's got this climate that the west is windy and wet, so we're over in the dry, sheltered east part of the country. And so we were working in this area of 200 square kilometres, and we were given the job of understanding better the vernacular traditions of building with clay between the cities of Dundee over on the right and Perth over on the left. And so we came up with a project to try and investigate that. So this is the landscape we're talking about. This is the River Tay, the largest catchment in Europe of any river, mountains of the Cairngorms in the distance, and this flat band of clay soil rising to hills to the north. And that's what it looks when you're on the hills looking down towards the Tay. So an agricultural area of the country. And we knew at the start that there was this tradition of earth buildings, like there were maybe four or five listed buildings that we knew about, but nobody had really looked at them systematically. So that's what we wanted to do, and there were bits and pieces lying about, falling down in fields. So over 2 years we did a survey, and we just took that word, do a survey, and stretched it to all the possible limits we could to learn as much as we could, and we wrote it up in 2 volumes of a report, which I hope to have here to distribute, but the printing got screwed up, so I don't. So if anybody wants one, just email me and we'll send it out to you, and you'll be able to download it as well. And what we went from in that survey, so there's 2 volumes, one's a kind of narrative, kind of explaining what we understood about what we found, and the other was a list of the buildings we found, and the key thing was really we went from half a dozen building up to 147 surviving earth buildings, which surprised us, and I'm just going to talk you through a few of the surprises that we found in those 2 years. And part of the process and the methodology we went through as a landscape heritage project. So we started off looking at the ground beneath our feet and the geology, and using geological maps, which I think are a great tool, and we've got some really nice ones in Scotland, and finding that 40% of the soil was good for building with, and you could categorise how it might best be used. And then we analysed place names, and I think we found 17 different place names that had a direct relationship to building with clay. Places like Claytown or Clay Biggins being building. And we tried really hard. All the place names were English place names, which means they're generally speaking after the 9th century. We tried really hard to find a Gaelic place name associated with earth or clay, and failed to find it. And then we, because we had a limited amount of money and a limited number of people, we worked with community volunteers. So we asked people who were interested in this project to come and volunteer, and we sent them out looking in people's back gardens and sheds and poking at walls. So we spent a year doing this sort of what we call field work, going out into fields and looking at stuff, and then tried to make sense of it. And we came up with buildings like this, which is a mud wall building, except it's a lot more. It's a lot more complicated than that. I don't have time to go into that, but we found some really interesting and unusual stuff that just hadn't been recorded. And it's amazing how you can still go out there, and if you look about, you can just find stuff even after all those years. And the important thing was the diversity. All the houses these half a dozen buildings, they were all domestic properties. But we found when we looked at it, yes, we had homes, but there were also castles and forts. There were churches and ecclesiastical buildings. We had bridges and walls. There were ducats and ice houses. There were farms. There were friaries and monasteries. And we even had windmills and smithies. So really every kind of building you could find earth in. And really it was this thing of there are no boundaries really. When you start looking systematically and you find what is the limit of earth building, you really struggle to find the limits. The limit was really a time one, in that you could look as far back as you could to when people started building buildings here 6,000 years ago, and Earth just keeps on going as far back as you look, and it carries on as people multiply, and then it kind of reached its peak of vernacular construction in the 18th and 19th century, and then it kind of falls off a cliff as lime comes in, and then cement and gypsum just take over the world. And we have this beautiful blip here when our our Italian friends came to visit and built a massive legionary fortress by the River Tay with 1,000 legionaries for about 150 years, and then they went away home again. But the interesting thing is, it's like people were saying this morning, our view of our heritage is dominated by these late buildings, partly because so many of them survive because they're relatively recent, but when you look back, and there's that diversity there, you look back and the number of buildings and the materials get simpler and simpler, but that's the span of human existence. Really, these late ones, it's 250, 500 years, but you got 4,500 years when people were really living in wattle and daub and in turf buildings. And because these things have just faded into landscape, we've forgotten that, but there was so much of that stuff. Anyway, so things like this, and now those things that fade into the landscape and into our memory, they just become, bumps in the landscape as these roundhouses or the rings around a hill fort, and they're there if you can look at them. But these were, turf and stone and wattle and daub and thatched buildings that were what our people lived in for most of the time we have been in this place, and we rummaged about in the archives of museums. And this was really interesting because there was this massive legionary fortress, like 1,000 legionaries lived there, and but they systematically destroyed it at the end when they went back to Rome, and there's been like 4 or 5 excavations. And the really interesting thing was we found in the museum in Dundee there's like 2,000 fragments of Roman daub, and you can still see the impression of the osiers, the framework they were in, and this is that process. But when archaeologists excavate wattle and daub structures, they really take a lot of care to excavate the wattles. But in doing that, they take all the daub away. And when you're interested in the daub, it's so frustrating because you never get daub as an artifact from a site. And you say, yeah, I've seen willows, wattles before. I want to see the daub. What was the 13th century daub like? And no, we cleaned it all away. But this survived. We had like these hundreds of fragments, all in these very careful boxes on shelves. And they survived because when the Romans destroyed the fortress, they torched it, and so they were ceramicized. And as soon as they were ceramicized, they became archaeological artifacts, and therefore they were saved, which is brilliant. So that was our earliest example of wattle, which we can thank our Italian friends for. And so in that survey, we looked at all the different ways people used earth, and people used earth in any possible way they could think of to use. And wattle and daub was so important. So this is an excavation of Perth High Street from about the 12th, 13th century, showing twin walls of wattle with infill in between, a clay floor, and where a hearth had been. And you could see these whole wattles still down there. And these would have looked buildings like this, so we're very familiar from walking around here of what they would actually have been like. But that was the high street in Perth, 900 years ago. But you would find them in a round tower, so again, familiar to our Irish friends. Clay mortared masonry in there, Pictish building, 13th century. If you poke about with permission into these monuments, you can find clay mortar in about them. Medieval castles, high status buildings. This fragment of part of this survives, this round tower, and in the base of that, clay mortared masonry and a clay floor, and then going through those typologies and the later 18th, 19th century vernacular buildings of mass clay wall, mud wall buildings, and what those would have looked like, where we've got really just one or two surviving examples that are in good conditions as being typologically representative, with their mud often covered with lime render as a weathering coat, and with what we would call mud and stud internal partitions, and often clay plasters. And I think there's loads of clay plasters out there. You just don't see them because they're covered up with wallpaper and paints and other things. And so it's quite hard in doing a survey to record the stuff that's out there, because unless a building's actually in a process of decay, it's hard to persuade people to let you rip off the wallpaper and paint to prove there's clay plaster there. And it's the same on the outside, so later buildings would be faced with brick and renders, and we knew by our various means that these were mud wall buildings, but you wouldn't appreciate it from walking down the high street. And so we mapped these. So this is the map of the mud wall buildings, which you would call Cob or Clom or whatever. And what it shows is, so the red star ones are the ones that survived, and the green ones are the ones that we knew have been lost. And we were correlating these then to the subsoil geology. And what it showed is that mud wall buildings were always built on a clay soil, or within about 50 yards of where clay soils were. And outside that, they weren't built of mud wall. They were built of earth mortared masonry, largely, because you got away from the clay floodplain and you went up to where there was stone in the hills. And so using rubble with clay mortared to make the walls. Buildings like these. And again, when buildings are falling down, it's really useful for survey work because you can see what they're made of. And the map for those showed that they were really built everywhere. And what that means is that people were using clay mortar, not just in the area where there was clay for the soils. So it was the everyday material for building masonry was clay mortar, and they would source clay from quite far away and transport it and work it and use it in construction. You wouldn't do that for mud wall because you had to get tons of the stuff to do a building, so it's a much more laborious. With mud mortar, you use less of it for the mass of the wall, and it was such a good material they would go through that process, and it was part of the process of constructing buildings. So there's this association then of earth buildings with the humbler homes were poultry and mean. So there's this place Longforgan where the buildings were very lowly. They were narrow, low-roofed and inconvenient. They were built of turf and stone or with clay for mortar, and all thatched with turf or straw. And there was not a trace of lime to be seen in 17th century, 1777 in the House of Building. And the importance here is Longforgan is like 5 miles outside Dundee, which is a major city in Scotland. And so it was somewhere that had easy access to lime and other building materials. But at the end of the 18th century, there was no lime used at all. It was all earth and turf and stone. And that surprised us. And this is Longforgan now, and you wouldn't know that. And that's because the whole town was owned by one estate. And it appeared about 20 years in about 1800, they knocked all those old buildings down and replaced them with new buildings, which are these buildings here, all built about 1800, 1820. And happily, as we went down the street, there was a skip, and the people were doing work to the building, and it was the owners were doing it up. So we went inside, and what did we see? We found a clay floor, and we found clay mortared walls. So even though this was these improved buildings, they still were doing earth mortared masonry, and they were doing clay floors. They just had taken away the turf. And it's one of these things from the earlier discussion, the words then, we went through all the records of how people had described their buildings. And you can see the results. Humble, lowly, mean, naughty, paltry, ugly, inferior, poor as can be, wretched, rudely constructed, damp, peculiar, but also warm and durable. So what does this tell us? This tells you that the people that describe buildings historically were not the people that lived in them. They were the landed gentry, they were the people who were doing agricultural surveys, they were the people that were improving estates, who were from a different class of people than were living in the buildings. And they also had an agenda where they were knocking these buildings down and replacing them, and they were moving people to other places and to different styles of employment. But when you got a description of people who were acting with, they actually often said these are more comfortable than the new homes that are coming in. And there's an inscription there, my earth house is my castle. So then the other thing that surprised us was how much change there'd actually been in this landscape, which we thought was fairly stable. So one of the biggest settlements between Perth and Dundee in the medieval era was a place called Pittmiddle, which is a Pictish name, so it's an old place. This is what it looked like about the turn of the century. Nice tradition, but this is what it looks like now. So this is a settlement that was abandoned progressively through the 20th century because it had no main services, water or electricity, and there wasn't a road that was maintained by the council. And this is, we think of abandonment of abandoned settlements as being something of medieval or of an era from the clearances or from the Highlands, remote places. But this is lowland Scotland between Perth and Dundee, 20th century, a ruined and abandoned village. This is what it had looked like, and this is what it's like now. And it had originally been these turf and earth buildings. They opened up a quarry about 1800 and built these improvement houses, again all with earth mortar, apart from the one where the mason lived, where he had some lime into the mix. So in this one you can see there is some quicklime in the mortar. And it was interesting when we looked at the earth mortar buildings, because some of the ones that survived really well were earth mortared, and there was a correlation with lime mortared ones. Some of the lime mortared ones survived really badly, and we tried to understand that. And then we came across this, and this is just such an interesting building. So this is a ducat, which are not strong buildings because you're making all these little boxes for the doves to live in, and it had these baronial corner towers. But this actually dates from 1680. It's a ducat for a castle, and it's been ruined for as long as there are any records. And it's built from basalt, which is really hard stone, and yet it's earth mortar masonry. You can see the remnants of a lime harl here, which just has disappeared, weathered off. But the earth mortar is fat. You can practically see the tool marks in that. Now there is lime in that, so it's an earth lime mortar, but somehow that mortar has survived just amazingly well in the conditions it's been in, and we don't really understand why. So trotting along, the other things we did a landscape heritage project to try and understand or engage people in the history of their place, working with archaeologists and artists to do a process of landscape artistry. And I guess what we were trying to do is make these connections not just with the buildings, but with the people who had inhabited them. And this is the footprint of within a clay floor that was extracted from a local building. And you could tell by the handprints that you find and the footprints that the people were often, I think, women and children that worked on these buildings as much as men. And you look at these pictures and you try and connect with the lives of the people that have vanished, because if the buildings have vanished, then so have the communities that went with them. And I guess in this project you're always trying to reach back, and we were looking for patterns, these patterns of typologies and materials and through time, and the patterns and the people as well. And so you come to this thing of who were the people that built these buildings, and these descriptions, as there is no stone in the neighbourhood, they're mostly built by clay. And the key thing is here, in forming such edifices, every man is his own mason. So there weren't any masons in this area, people just built their own homes. and so it wasn't a profession or a craft that was protected. And we know that there were churches that were built by the congregations, and so on. And it brings us now to where we are with our work to develop skills and qualifications. And so we worked on repair projects with people to train them up in skills on buildings, both professional masons, but also the people that occupy and look after these buildings themselves, so that they can tend for them in the future. And I was just going to quickly show you the new building that we worked with the community to produce after we had to take all the ones down from Clayfest 2015. And to try and connect it and somehow make it a living tradition, so that not just in the buildings but in people's relationship to their landscape and the place that they inhabit, you know, not just as individuals in individual buildings, but as a people and a place and a culture. Thank you very much.